Brilliant. Thank you. And yeah, thank you for having me. And I suppose thank you to all the Extinction Rebellion volunteers. I'm in a fortunate position of being in a position to be paid effectively to be a green campaigner. But I know most people who do it in their own time. And you know, we were discussing before sort of people came online, the challenges of trying to put together the movement in Northern Ireland and try and sort of coordinate a lot of good intention and passion. It's a worthwhile cause and it's a necessary cause, but it takes a lot of hard work and effort. So, you know, I'll start with my thanks for everybody who puts in that time and effort. I'm going to share my screen. Technology has not been my friend today, but I'm hopeful that this will work okay. And I can get, is everybody seeing that okay? I'll talk away and happy to kind of discussion at the end. I knew I'd do this. I can't get on my toolbars in the way of, there we go, slideshow. So yeah, I'll take questions at the end, but look, I'm conscious that most of my presentations are usually to industry, people who are involved in the energy industry. So if I start using acronyms that don't make sense to people, if somebody just shouts at me and I'll explain what I'm talking about a bit better. But hopefully most of what I say will agree of sense. So first off, to explain who RenewableNI is, that's who I work for now. We're a trade association for the renewable electricity industry. Our members would be engaged in wind, solar, and storage, typically, both onshore and offshore, large scale and small scale. We kind of went against the grain, or our current associations went against the grain of how Northern Ireland usually is, being the place that divided the two islands. It was the place that brought the two islands together. So back in the day, maybe around 12 years ago, Renewable UK, the industry body in Great Britain, and Ireland, the industry body in the Republic of Ireland, came together to create RenewableNI through a kind of memorandum of understanding. So they kind of guarantee my job. And then through the membership money that I raise and through our events, etc., that's what funds the small staff team that we have. So these are some of our, as I say, it kind of ranges from large and small scale developers and across the technologies that I mentioned, wind, solar, and tidal. But you'll see a lot of lawyers there if you recognize some of the logos, and environmental consultants and basically, and some manufacturers, basically anyone throughout the renewable supply chain. You know, we try to get involved and try to represent the industry as a whole. So getting into the policy space, then I've deliberately mixed metrics here, from 40 by 20 to 0 by 50. So 40 by 20 was the original renewables target. It was 40% renewables by 2020, which thankfully we achieved, and indeed achieved ahead of time. But even in the renewables industry, we recognize renewables are a means to an end rather than end in themselves. It's not really about the amount of renewables we have. It's about the level of decarbonisation, or the carbon intensity of the energy sector. So obviously the new target is zero carbon energy by 2050, and happy to sort of take questions about whether or not we can go quicker. I'm sure some on the call think we can and should. I'll focus primarily on the electricity sector or the power sector. Probably use the two terms interchangeably, although more technical people than me will tell me the difference between electricity and power. But as I say, for purposes, I'll use them interchangeably. And as I say, I think it's important that zero carbon and decarbonisation is where the policy focus is. I still don't think we're entirely in terms of government in Northern Ireland. But I'll speak a bit to that. Should explain the two documents on the outside are the strategic energy framework on the left hand, on the far left, and the new energy strategy on the far right. In between are reports that we've published that we hopefully have used to influence the change to move towards zero carbon energy and achieving zero, as Angelos has mentioned, will be the focus of my discussion today. But likes of the wind dividend shows how renewables bring down prices, empowering news about how the smaller scale communities have benefited from renewables, and empowering the green economy by KPMG was really looking at really how we can deliver a green recovery from COVID. So RenewableNI's key objectives. So as I say, renewables for us aren't an end in themselves. Ultimately, what we want to see is a zero carbon power system. And our best estimate is we can do that by 2035. And we didn't sort of pluck that out of the air. We had this report, Achieving Zero. We commissioned a company called Baringa, who would be energy experts. And they essentially said the conclusion of the report, sort of jumped to the end first, was that we can get to zero carbon power using technologies that are known to us today. So there's no great innovation needed. We don't need to invent new technology. This can be done. They actually said, by 2030, knowing the steps that need to happen in between times, and I suppose knowing how slowly political wheels turn, we sort of said 2035, and that was based on the International Energy Agency said that every advanced economy should be at zero carbon power by 2035. And as well as that, it was sort of our best estimate as to when, if you're going to be fully zero carbon energy by 2050, where power needs to be, and I'll explain a bit later why power has and will lead the way. What we do have, so at the minute, that zero carbon power by 2035 is a RenewableNI target. It's also a UK government target, but because energy's devolved, that target's really only for Great Britain. We don't have that target in Northern Ireland policy yet. What we do have is an 80% renewables target, which, don't get me wrong, I campaigned for 2 years to get it. I welcome it, but it should only ever be seen as a stepping stone towards going fully zero carbon. And the reason I say that, because the old target for 2020, the 40% renewable target, basically we hit it around about 2017, 2018, and the department just took its foot off the gas. Or that's probably the wrong analogy, but they basically just said we don't need to do any more renewables, and we didn't build any new large scale renewables in Northern Ireland for 3 years, which, given everything we knew then, but particularly what we know now, was such a mistake. And there was a feeling by some people really thought we would stop at 40% and that was enough, and that we couldn't or shouldn't go further. So what we don't want to see is us get to 2030, achieving our 80% target, and again, having a number of years hiatus while we work out new policy. We need to think what is the end goal and work back from it, rather than get too hung up on these milestones. I'll not go too much into these enablers. Renewable electricity support scheme. So we're the only part of these islands that don't have any government-backed support, and by that I appreciate the language. That sounds very much like subsidy, but the industry has moved away from subsidies. But what has happened in Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland is a price guarantee, and that price guarantee works for both the consumer and the generator. So, when COVID hit and the price of electricity dropped through the floor, renewable generators were protected from that. But as prices have risen, like so this year, actually renewable generators who are signed up to the support scheme in Great Britain or in Republic of Ireland actually pay back to the consumer. So it doesn't get a lot of attention, unfortunately, but colleagues in Renewable UK estimated that in a single quarter, £120 million was paid by renewable generators back to the consumer. So that we want something similar in Northern Ireland. As I say, it's both good for generator and the consumer. A facilitated planning system, and I'll speak a wee bit about more about this later, but basically planning in Northern Ireland takes too long, and too often, certainly in more recent times, we're getting refusals on planning applications for wind farms. So we get a lot of fine words about acting on climate, but actually when it comes to climate solutions, they're being blocked by some of our statutory processes, or delayed to the point where it's deterring investment. Then offshore leasing round, that's something that we've all but secured. We just don't have this quite the timeline yet for it, but we've got an agreement in principle, and this is the seabed rights are essentially owned by the Crown Estate, so they decide who gets to develop any projects offshore. Northern Ireland hasn't been included in recent leasing rounds because, going back to the policy of not doing any more renewables for a while, effectively, meant we just weren't really on their radar. So that's something through my work I'm trying to put right. So just to give you a sense of where we are now, so through the increase in renewables, 2020, I put in 2020, that should be 2021, more than 41% of NI's electricity came from renewables. Actually, in 2020, it was very nearly 50%. It was something like 49.2. We had a low demand year, obviously because of COVID, and the wind still was kind of blowing. So we reached our highest level of renewables in 2021. It's dipped this year because demand's increased. Last year's demand increased, and we also had a low wind year last year. So, the proportion of renewables varies, but we're consistently over 40% now, and we have come close to 50%. But as I mentioned earlier, power has to do the heavy lifting here, because we've turned the corner significantly, as I alluded to. We have the technology; it's now proven, it's now established. It's cost effective as well, which I'll come to. So we've approximately decarbonised power by around 45%, whereas transport's about 2%. And we don't actually have, or at least I can't find, reliable figures for heat. And I think this was an issue that came up when the strategic energy framework that I mentioned, which was the old 2020 policy, had a 10% heat reduction decarbonisation target for heat. And one of the reasons why we don't know if we met it is because we don't have the data to measure heat in that way. So, but anything I've sort of read is never put it over anything more than kind of 5% decarbonisation. So power's led the way and will continue to lead the way. I think we're fairly clear on where transport is going. Electrification plus some hydrogen vehicles. There are sort of some other options around kind of decarbonised gas solutions, but I think it will be primarily electric for domestic transport and hydrogen for more heavy goods vehicles. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about hydrogen. Heat, we really don't know what path we're taking. We could install heat pumps in all the homes, but that's going to be expensive and take a lot of work. We could decarbonise gas through biomethane and hydrogen and let you keep your gas boiler, but you'll need to replace it anyway because it can only take up to, say, 10% hydrogen. So there's a lot of talk about, and there's a lot of interest in continuing to use the gas infrastructure and wanting to make use of that asset rather than it becoming a stranded asset. So we don't have a clear pathway for heat. As I say, transport to me is a bit clearer, but for power, through our Achieving Zero report, we have a real pathway. And as my colleague, I'll give credit where it's due, my colleague in Wind Energy Ireland, Noel Cuniff, always says, if you want to decarbonise something, stick a plug on it, because we can decarbonise electricity much easier than current modes of heat and transport. Zero carbon power by 2035. I'll not go too much into the detail of this graph, but it just kind of shows you in a stepped way. And again, this is from the Achieving Zero report, how we can decarbonise the electricity sector. So these are kind of in a way meaningless figures until you sort of stare at them every day, all day. But our current electricity sector in Northern Ireland is about 3 million tons of carbon equivalent per year. By going to 70% renewables from where we are today, takes it down to about 1.3 million. If we go to 80%, takes off another 0.6 million. And then there's further iterative steps we need to get to zero carbon. I suppose what this slightly shows is it's not all about 100% renewables. We will need some form of backup generation for the times when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And that's most likely, there's two ways we can do that. And it's probably going to be a mix of both, either through battery storage or through hydrogen. And the advantage of hydrogen is you can potentially retrofit one of our existing power stations. And as long as it's green hydrogen, again, which I'll come on to, decarbonize that kind of large thermal plant and say it run the system in a way that's still familiar to us today, albeit with a larger penetration of renewables, 80–90%, but having that backup hydrogen generation. Battery storage can do the same job. At the minute, both for hydrogen and battery storage, we need to develop markets because we know how to use them. We know the technology, but at the minute, there's no incentive for anyone to invest in them because there's no way of making a return on your investment at the minute. There is some battery storage, but it's what we call fast response battery storage. What we need is long duration storage for that backup generation. I think that's everything in this slide. So just a bit about hydrogen then, because I certainly have picked up within the green movement, there's almost suspicion of hydrogen, and I probably started off in that space as well. There are many different colors of hydrogen, so that's why I've said any color of hydrogen as long as it's green. Grey hydrogen is currently used by industry, but it's essentially produced using fossil fuels. And I think everyone agrees, thankfully, that again, it's something we have to decarbonize, and it's not the long-term solution. Blue hydrogen's the kind of controversial one, which certainly in Great Britain policymakers seem to like. In Northern Ireland, I've heard different takes on whether or not Northern Ireland would ever be viable in terms of the level of demand here. So to explain what blue hydrogen is when you create hydrogen using fossil fuels, but you capture the carbon. So the argument is it's just as green hydrogen, except carbon leakage, which we already get with the gas industry, and as well as carbon leakage with the carbon capture system. Do you capture it at all? That's yet to be proven. But also the fact if you're still using fossil gas and you're still extracting fossil gas, you get methane leakage further down the chain as well. So blue hydrogen, despite the PR, is not as green as it claims to be. Yes, maybe it's better than grey hydrogen, but it seems to me a waste of time, money, and effort when we have the resources needed to produce green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is what you get when you use wind or solar power to power an electrolyzer, which splits the hydrogen atoms out of water, and you're left with hydrogen and oxygen. And there are some proposed solutions for oxygen and wastewater treatment, but I'll focus on the power sector. As I say, really, hydrogen to me will be the key unlocker to allowing us to go to fully zero, because as I say, it will answer that age-old question: what do you do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? Well, if you've stored your electricity in the form of hydrogen, then you can still produce that energy. And when you burn hydrogen, all you get is water. You can essentially convert it back to water. Again, I'm not a scientist. If anybody asks me too many technical questions on it, but it is a clean form of producing energy. And then cost, I thought it's always worth mentioning cost just to help our campaigning, because there are still those in our society who like to claim, but renewables are really expensive, you know, and is that not the reason why our energy prices are going up? Well, no, it's not. The energy prices are going up because of the cost of gas. And the more we have renewables on the system, less we rely on gas and the lower the prices will be. And indeed, as an industry, one of our biggest challenges is actually as we move towards taking gas off the system, sort of whisper it quietly at the minute, renewables rely on gas, to the gas setting the price to make our industry profitable. The problem is when you have a zero cost fuel, which the wind and solar is, but high capital intensive cost in terms of setting up a wind farm or a solar farm. You know, who's going to pay if your fuel price is zero? Who's going to pay to build those wind farms if gas isn't setting the price? So the problem with renewables is the risk of becoming too cheap, that it stops being investable. So it's finding that balance. But I do believe there's, you know, there will be solution found. It will be good for the consumer, and I do believe when we're in a zero carbon, fully zero carbon electricity system, we'll definitely see stable prices and certainly cheaper prices than what we're seeing today. And that's just to show, and that this is actually a couple of years old. So this slide is before the invasion of Ukraine, and just, yeah, as you can kind of see that you know, gas is up to double the price of renewables. And this, again, get a wee bit technical. This is the levelized cost of electricity. So this is once you've all your construction costs and whatever factored in, and all the grid costs, because it is a true thing about renewables. We've had to invest heavily in our grid because the wind blows in the west, but wind blows best in the north and the west, but the population's in the east. So it used to be all the infrastructure was in the east. We have had to invest massively to build it out to the west, but because overall renewables brings the price down, we've actually done it while saving the consumer money. So it hasn't been at any stage what's driven up the cost, but there will always be those who will try to put the blame on renewables. And you can see in that graph, the big difference between renewables and gas in terms of cost is fuel. There is no fuel cost, obviously, for renewables. The planning challenge, something that's kicked around. It's why I'm really kind of delighted to speak to this audience, because when we're talking in the industry and we're talking to ourselves, we often ask the question, how do we get people to put wind turbines on placards and say we want these? Because inevitably what happens when we put in a planning application for a wind farm is we get objections. Now that doesn't mean to say the community doesn't want them. It means a part of the community doesn't want them, but it's the part that gets heard very often. And look, I've been on both sides of planning. I've been an objector and I've campaigned and I've got the signatures, and I've been part of a vocal, maybe minority at times, who knows. But you know, the evidence is there. The BEIS, the UK government department, does a public attitudes tracker, and consistently Northern Ireland shows the highest support for renewables of any region in the UK. But when we come to put in a planning application, we only hear about the objectors, and that's who the politicians hear, and that's often whose voice is heard and whose decision or whose opinions taken on board when the decision's made. So, you know, there is a question, and if I think our job's hard in the renewables industry, our colleagues who do the grid have an even harder job, because pylons, some people like wind turbines, some people don't, but I don't think anyone looks at a pylon and says it looks great. They are arguably ugly big structures, but they're necessary if we want to get the electricity our members generate to the consumer. So pylons are part of the climate solution, and you know, I think that's something we all have to realize, and if we want to see, and I suppose so. I've given the example of the Dorville project because it was incredibly controversial. Would have been Northern Ireland's largest wind farm. It was going to be in the Spurrins, And people go, well, why there? And I remember when I was in MLA being shown two graphs, two maps. One was of all the best wind speeds in Northern Ireland, and one was of all the visually sensitive areas. So, you know, the likes of the Spurns, all our, valued environmental or valued landscape. And they were effectively the same map. Where the wind speeds are good is where, you know, the landscapes we value, because you put turbines on hills, it's just where the wind is. And so there's no way of hiding these. You can, to be fair, hide a solar farm pretty well. You can hide a battery storage project pretty well. You can't hide a wind farm. If you do, you block the wind. So it's just one of the necessities. And, you know, look, it's a personal opinion and whatever, but when it comes to a choice between the greatest threat facing humanity, which is climate change, and visual impact, I just, you know, I come down on, we have to tackle climate change, and we can't say, yeah, we want to tackle climate change, but not this way. This is the way. This is the way that works. Is again going back to those figures of, we've tried to decarbonize heat and transport through other means. The way we'll do it is to electrify, and the way we'll produce the electricity will be wind, onshore, and you know, I always get asked as well, can we not do it all offshore, or can we not do small scale? Is it not better to do community-owned wind? To me, it's onshore and offshore. It's large scale and small scale. It's wind and solar. We're going to need all these solutions if we want to get to zero carbon. And I suppose just one other thing on the planning challenge. From a generation point of view, bigger is better. From a visual impact point of view, it's a debate, because give you an example, I think it was the first wind farm in the Republic, had 11 turbines. It recently came to the end of its life, and those turbines were taken down, replaced by 5 new ones, and the 5 new ones produced double the electricity of the old 11, because they were bigger, they were taller. Again, the visual impact therefore is increased, but you get less, or you get more from less. And again, you know, that's something through our planning system that we as a community have to decide, are we willing to accept larger turbines if it means less of them and greater renewable output. So I think that's me, except just to say we run a number of webinars. These are all available on our website. So if you want to learn more, the final one in that webinar series, Going Offshore, will be on the 6th of September. So it hasn't taken place yet, but the others are on our website. And we run an annual conference, the Smart Energy Conference, which will take place on the 6th of October. And other than that, just thank you. And yeah, look forward to the questions. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was great. I'm just going to go straight over to the chat there, and I see that Richard Boyd has asked a couple of questions. Richard, if you're able to unmute yourself and ask, and do you want to chat to Stephen? If you're there.
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm on text only at the minute because I'm putting the girls to bed, so apologies. Yeah, apologies.
Don't worry. Shall I go ahead and ask your questions here, Richard?
Yeah. Please, yes.
No worries at all. So you can probably see them there yourself too in the chat, Stephen. Yeah. Richard asked, what role do you see community energy groups in supporting net zero energy?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because, and again, it is one of those policy questions. Now, we support community energy. Indeed, we have Drumlin Wind Co-op as one of our members, which is a community-owned wind cooperative, which I'm delighted to be a member myself, or a shareholder technically. The reality, you know, there's two sides to this. If you want the most electricity for the cheapest price, you go big. The bigger you go in terms of the bigger the wind farm, the bigger the solar farm, the more more electricity you get. But I think one of the successes of renewables has been the democratization of energy. So we used to have 3 power stations. We now have approximately 23,000, if you count every sort of home with solar panels. So, and I think that's a good thing. And there is a premium to be paid for kind of community-based or those smaller scale renewables. And, you know, in terms of, for example, the subsidy we used in the past, but one of the reports I referenced earlier, Empowering You, shows that actually that premium has reduced significantly. It used to be 4 times as much to support a single wind turbine compared to a wind farm. That's come down to about maybe a 20% premium. So I think that's something worth paying. And plus, from just maybe a pragmatic, selfish point of view, I think the more people who have access to renewables, the more support we're going to get when we come and put them in. So I think there's lots of reasons to do this. I think, unfortunately, I don't see the policy support for community energy in the energy strategy. It was consulted on, there were questions on it, and it was noticeably absent from the energy strategy itself. So I think there's still work to do to make that argument. I mentioned before Northern Ireland not having a support scheme. One of the arguments we'll be making is that the GB model is only open to projects over 5 megawatts. We're arguing to reduce that down to 1 megawatt, which is still pretty big. But you know, we think it's what's achievable, and certainly would increase the chance of maybe communities contributing or getting involved.
Yeah, sounds really important. Richard asked another question. What role do you see? Sounds like I know what I'm talking about. What role do you see DSR, demand side response, for residents and business in the role to net zero energy?
Yeah, so I suppose a lot of what I've talked about, because what our members do is generation. But if you know, one of the things we often hear, really technical term here, we have peaky demand. We have peak, it goes up and peaks, you know, so 6 o'clock when everybody gets back from work and switches the TV on and the kettle on and the cooker on, the demand rockets up. And that's not really good. That's grand if you've got systems that you can turn up and down, but you can't do that with a wind turbine. It doesn't turn on and off when you want it to. Fortunately, you can turn them off whenever you want, but you can't turn them on whenever you want if the wind's not blowing. So what demand side response could do is help kind of level out that demand and match it better to the supply. And it's things like the wind's blowing at night. You know, we could be charging our electric cars at night when the wind's blowing and we're not otherwise using the electricity, and also sending the consumer. So one of the things we can do if we ever introduce smart metering is you could get a signal from your smart meter that says, oh, electricity prices just dropped because the wind's blowing. You know, yeah. Stick your laundry on now. So there are ways that we could deliver cheaper energy to the consumer, but also provide, the consumer would be providing a system service, because it's actually treated as a service if you can manage that demand. So I think, again, I don't see a lot of it in the energy strategy, but it definitely needs to be somewhere. I think we're scared of smart meters in Northern Ireland, and there was, I don't know too much of the hows and whys, but a disastrous rollout in England. But it wasn't the technology that was wrong, it was the policy. The technology worked, the policy didn't work so well. So I think there's a fear of getting it wrong in Northern Ireland, but we have to bite the bullet at some point.
So that's at least those first two things you've talked about slightly missing from the energy policy. So this, yeah. Doris, are you there? Do you want to ask your question?
That's fine. Let me just remember. It was about carbon storage, basically, when you put up that target of zero carbon power by 2035, based on that it could be done with the existing technology now. It doesn't require new innovations, but how much is carbon storage factored in, which arguably is a known technology now?
Yeah, no, none is the simple answer. So it, I say, there would be storage of electricity in the form of battery or converting it through hydrogen. But no, this is zero carbon power in the real sense, as opposed to net zero carbon power, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's a zero carbon power system.
Yeah, thanks. That's clarified that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Rosie, is Tam still there with you? Tam had a question.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Tam.
My background was in electricity a few years ago before I retired. Is there any plans, do you know, for, Altahullion is the biggest wind farm in Ireland, it's up in County Derry. I think it's about an output of about 26 megawatt. Remember right? But there was a scheme, when I was a young lad up in Camelot in South Armagh, the pump storage, where it had the potential of developing maybe 70 megawatt, which would probably produce enough power for about maybe 50,000 homes at peak. Is that the most of the building, all the tunnel work I think was done, but then I think the generation equipment was scrapped after a while when it sort of fell out of a favor during the Troubles. And I wonder, in your experience, or what do you know, is there any word of maybe getting that up and running again?
Funny, I get asked this question occasionally, and there's nothing that I'm aware of. And again, I mentioned long duration storage. Pump storage is another form of storage. So I was largely talking in terms of battery, but pump storage is another way of providing that backup generation when the wind doesn't blow. What bit like the long duration battery storage, it's probably the reason why it hasn't been revisited is because the lack of market. So at the minute, we know how to compensate generators to make it worthwhile their investment. We have a system called DS3, which rewards short-term battery storage. But at the minute, we haven't developed anything that rewards that long-term storage. So, I think if we develop that system, something like Pumptoro, Camlock pump storage could well come back. But as I say, I think at the minute it probably cost a lot of money to get it up and running, and people are going, well, I wouldn't get my money back. So until we solve that end, I don't see anyone investing in it.
It was a good scheme, and we were hoping it maybe could keep the money, maybe part of the money in the community as well, if it is some way of, compensating the community or helping them to be even employed in the construction of it or development or production or the ongoing work of it. It'd be an amazing one-off chance, I think. Yeah, no,
absolutely. And these things, these are kind of almost natural advantages you have or you don't have, and I think there's too many other sites like Camlock in Northern Ireland, if any. So the potential is definitely there. As I say, just for somebody to put the money in, they'd want to see some way of getting a return, and that doesn't exist yet.
Well, if just finally, would there be any grants from Europe to help with the construction of that?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, obviously we're sort of half in, half out with Europe, and
that's the thing,
I think in terms of the grant tap, we're sort of at the end of that. But so yeah, I don't see Europe being our answer, unfortunately.
That's good. Thank you, Stephen.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Tam. Colin, are you there? Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much, Stephen, for the talk. It was really, really interesting to hear that. And sorry, I came a little bit late. It was something you had mentioned about storing renewable energy in forms of, like you said, as hydrogen or in long-term battery storage. I was wondering, do you know if there's any capacity for sand storage or heating for heat in kind of sand silos? We've done that in Finland. I was wondering, because it's a bit of a cheap form of storing energy. Do you know if there's capacity for that within Northern Ireland?
The truth is, I don't know. So I've heard of this, but it's a relatively new one to me, and I don't know too much about it. But you said it is being used. Sorry, in Finland?
Yeah. So they've done it in this city in Finland. They've been this year, and so they've just kind of demonstrated how useful it can be for that. Because I think if you have, it's thousands of tons of sand, so I think if you have such big silos, they can retain the heat quite well, and then you could use that energy then to whatever to generate energy in the future. So it's kind of a way of cheaply storing it. Like if it's cheap. Maybe no.
Well, I know as much as you've just told me, unfortunately, and it's in the heating side though, as well. So my role is primarily electricity, although as I say, with the kind of campaign to electrify things, to heating and electricity will hopefully go hand in hand. But yeah, I have heard said it sort of picked it up somewhere, whether it was on a Radio 4 program or something probably. But yeah, I don't know too much about it, but it's I mean, there's always great innovations in terms of renewables and different ways of doing things, and I suppose it's which ones become commercially viable ultimately win out. But my favorite one was always some school trialed creating energy from the vibrations of the pupils walking up and down the corridors, and I just thought that's the only school where they tell you to run down the corridor using more energy. But I'm guessing it never quite became commercially viable. But yeah, there's always incredibly interesting things that people come up with.
What about, just quickly then as well, what about the network for energy production for cars? Because I know it's quite limited. Do you know if there's plans to extend that?
Yeah, I mean, there is. Unfortunately, Northern Ireland had the best charging infrastructure when electric cars first came on the scene, and then we, a bit like renewables, we went, look how well we've done, and we sat back, and now we're one of the worst regions. So certainly a lot of talk about it. One of the things at the minute is, and I can see why this is a good thing from one perspective, but in Northern Ireland, all the cost of say you want to set up an electric charge point, all the cost of connecting that and all the grid infrastructure would fall on the developer. Whereas in Great Britain, that's partially socialized. It's only the final connection the developer pays for. The rest of the grid infrastructure is socialized through the consumer. Now, with prices being high at the minute, people maybe say, well, Northern Ireland's got it right, but in terms of getting those investments and building out that infrastructure, I think it's one of the reasons why we have gotten so far behind, because it's incredibly expensive to invest in. So, if we think of electric charging as a social good, we maybe need to find a way of socializing the costs, at least in part.
That's great. Thank you so much for that.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. So there's a bit of chat going on there about hydrogen that maybe we'll come back to. I just want to pass on if B is still there to ask her question about renewable electricity. Just trying to see if she's still in the room.
Yeah, I'm here. I actually, thank you. I actually arrived really late to the talk, so I didn't hear the beginning, unfortunately. I really regret that. But we're just moving to Northern Ireland from England. And in England, we do have a smart meter and love it, because we pay 4p a unit for charging our electrical car overnight. And we actually store electricity to use during the day. So we're sort of peak lobbing, if you like. And we want to do a similar thing here in Northern Ireland. So we really, really want a smart meter so we can get the cheap electricity when you want to get rid of it. So I don't fully understand why you thought it was a disaster in England, but I also want to know how we buy your renewable energy, your renewable electricity, please.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I suppose when I said it was a disaster in England, it certainly faced a lot of criticism in the press. I don't know too much of the hows and whys, as I said, but I know there was a lot of criticism of the rollout, and it was kind of seen as sort of poorly implemented, as I say, but not the technology. Those who got it, I think, benefited from it, as you outlined, say the technology works. I think it was just seen as a poor value for money for the taxpayer rollout. I think it ended up being quite expensive. As I say, I don't know why that is in terms of how it's been done in other countries. In terms of procuring renewable electricity, if you're not obviously generating it yourself through solar panels or the like, most electricity suppliers will have a green tariff whereby you essentially, you sign up and you say, I want renewables, and they've kind of an obligation to match the demand with renewable generation. So, a lot of our likes of SSE, for example, would be members of ours, or Energia, who own XRNI. So they have a generation side as well as their supplier side. So, it's a wee bit indirect in creating demand. We don't have sort of fully, I think there were some suppliers that claimed to be fully 100% renewables, but I know one of them went out of business, so I'm not sure if we've any at this point. But yeah, it's really just signing up with the supplier and sort of signing up for the green energy tariff. But it's this, just people point out, it's the same electricity comes, but they for every customer that says they want green energy, they do have to kind of produce green certificates to show they are matching that demand.
Okay, because in the UK we were with Octopus. Sorry, in England we were in Octopus with Octopus, which which is strictly renewable. That's all that.
There was Smart Energy here, but I think they went out of business, or maybe others. But I think primarily, I mean, we are. Each supplier has to declare, and increasingly we're seeing the rates of renewables go up across all the companies, but we're not in the supply side, so I've no vested interest in sort of promoting one or the other. But I think, to be fair, I think every company you point to is investing in renewables.
Okay, thank you for that answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, B. So I think hopefully we can squeeze in a couple more questions that we've got here. John, are you there? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, and thank you, Stephen. My question was about the utility regulator, who did a consultation recently and was almost invisible in what he or she or it wanted to hear from the public. My issue is we've got politics. It's all about meeting. It's such a squeeze with the budget. So, is the regulator fit for purpose? Are you, for instance, in contact with ESHIRIT? And is there a planning process? Sorry, it's an additional question. Is there a planning process to meet the demand for onshore wind turbines?
So your line's not great there, John, but I think I've caught most of the question. In terms of, is the utility regulator fit for purpose, I think its current mandate isn't fit for purpose, as opposed to, in a way, it being a question of ability or expertise. And I think John French would agree with me on that, who's our current chief executive of the utility regulator. So, but one of the unfortunate things was when I asked the department, when they would be bringing in an energy bill that would change that mandate to bring it up to speed with net zero. Because at the minute, the utility regulator's role is primarily to keep down consumer prices, and as laudable as that is, it sometimes means we don't get the investment in green energy or in the grid ultimately to facilitate green energy. So I think everybody agrees that needs to be changed, and they need a new net zero mandate. But when I spoke to the department, I said, is it likely to be in the next assembly, early in the next assembly, or later? And they said, oh, later. And then when I spoke to John French, he said he's been told 7 years. So we don't have that long. And what I put back to John then is, what can you do in terms of, and this is where, as I say, I think there's a lot of good people in the utility regulator, as alluded to. But I do think there needs to be a change of culture, because I think sometimes, even if your role is to keep down costs for the consumer, you can look to the long term rather than the short term. And even, investment in the grid is typically financed over 40 years. So, there's almost this attitude within some with the utility regulator that all cost is bad, but cost is sometimes investment. As I say, as we've brought on more renewables, and as we've invested in the grid, we've actually brought down the cost of electricity. It might not feel like it at the minute, but believe me, it's cheaper now than what it would be if we hadn't brought on renewables. And it's been gas that's driven that, as we all know. So I do think there's more can be done with the current mandate, but I do think the main reason is what I mean. The utility regulator and the department still have a legal obligation to promote the gas industry. You know, that is something that should not exist in net zero, in the net zero context, but it's a legal duty of both the department and the utility regulator to promote and facilitate the gas industry. So, you know, that has to go along with, as I say, a new mandate for utility regulation. In terms of the planning system, you know, one of my gripes, so I alluded to the fact that planning takes too long in Northern Ireland. It can take anything up to 7 years to get a wind farm through planning, where I've colleagues in the Republic complaining that it's taken them 18 months. And we're looking enviously going, we'd love 18 months, guys. There is one person, so those who know planning, every planning application has to go through certain statutory consultees, or every planning application of a certain type anyway has to go through statutory consultees. One of those is the Northern Ireland Environment Agency. There is one person employed within NIEA to look at every wind application. He is supposed to respond within 3 weeks. He typically responds within 12 months. And that's not because he's not efficient or not good at his job. It's because there's one of them. And even if that was 3, you know, and we're not talking, you know, we're talking huge investment in terms of what's coming from our side, but we're talking a small amount of public investment in the planning system to change that from 1 member of staff to 3 and take effectively a year off planning applications. So in that sense, our planning system certainly is not fit for purpose, and there's now multiple reports that have said that. Unfortunately, I don't see anything yet that makes me go, and it's getting better. I hope it will get better, but we haven't started to turn that corner yet.
Thank you. Mark, are you still there? Would you like to ask your question to Steven?
I was just setting up the conditions there. Yeah, so hi Stephen. My question was just in regards to the recyclability of some of the materials that we're using in these technologies, like the batteries and the electric cars and the let's say the fiberglass and the turbines and that. Is there any work that the government's doing, or are there any institutions that are kind of regulating that side of things, or is that something to look into?
Certainly I can speak to the blades. Those are the bit that can't be reused or recycled on turbines typically, and as you allude to, the kind of fiberglass. There is a project called Rewind, or Rewind, whatever way you want to pronounce it, and I know Queen's University are involved, and University College Cork among others. I know there's an American university, and I can't think off the top of my head. So it's largely kind of repurposing. So, you know, they've used blades to help build bridges, as you know, and other infrastructure. So it's kind of repurposing the blades where possible. Now, look, I'll be completely honest, because you know, I wouldn't want to mislead on this. It's at small scale at this minute. Largely what's happened, they're being stockpiled until the big solution's found. So, you know, I think there are a number of really kind of good pilot projects, but the big solution hasn't been found to the blade issues. You know, but yeah, I suppose your question was, is there work being done? There is, and you know, probably a quick Google of that. Well, Rewind's not a great thing to Google, but if you Google maybe Rewind University College Cork or Queen's University, you'll maybe find more info on it. So I would know less on the battery side. It's one that I'd have to go away and find out, to be honest, because I suppose batteries are relatively new in respect of storage. Obviously, in terms of electric vehicles, they're a bit more mature technology, but the sort of battery storage projects are in the beginning of their life, rather. than the end of it, but it's a fair question.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering because I suppose that any of these technologies have to take a kind of a holistic view and look through the whole life cycle of them.
Yeah, and look, funny, there is a company in Northern Ireland, B9 Energy, but to some extent, no energy is completely benign. There's precious metals and some of the issues in the terms of the mining for those and whatever. So there's always some degree of compromise, but I like to think we're the cleanest form of energy until we find a cleaner form.
Yeah. Aye, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I can see there's other bits of chat going on there, and it's great that people are kind of engaging with each other. I'm just conscious of the time and that we try and keep these talks, to the time that we've set out, as people will have other things to be up to with their evenings. But I think everybody, I'm sure, would like to thank you, Stephen, very much for all that you've shared tonight. Feels like on some levels there's things to feel really positive about, and in other places there's clearly a lot to campaign for, and gaps in policy, and changes in cultures and systems that we still really need to focus on. So thank you very, very much for your time this evening, and it's been really, really educational. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say.
Yeah, I suppose just maybe a closing comment in terms of, I suppose, always good to finish on an optimistic note. I think we're going in the right direction, just not quick enough. So I think that's, where a lot of my push, and my oft repeated phrase is we need a COVID response to climate. We've shown over COVID, government can move fast. The argument's always been it takes years. We've shown that in an emergency, we can act with speed. This is an emergency and government needs to start acting like it. I think the other thing to do is always worth doing a wee bit of a check on yourself. When I first got into politics, I couldn't talk about climate change because as soon as you did, people stopped listening. Now you've even got Edwin Poots bringing forward a climate bill, albeit maybe it wasn't ambitious enough or whatever, but he feels the need now to be seen to be acting on climate change. So we are winning, but we need to keep the pressure on to move further faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight. If you're interested in keeping an eye on XRNI talks, we run these talks kind of monthly-ish, and there's all sorts of other meetings, both of our regenerative culture and well-being group and of other groups that focus on more of the actions and things, and so you can find information. Facebook is probably the best place to go for that information and for other contact details for us. So yeah, thanks to everyone again for joining us, and I hope to see you all again somewhere, somehow, very soon. Go well, take care, bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
Thank you.
Come from Manny, yeah.
Bye.